Three Palestinians have been shot dead in what Israel said were thwarted knife attacks, but a Palestinian witness of one incident said Jewish settler violence was to blame. Well, let's get more on this cycle of violence that's flaring up in Israel and the West Bank. Joining me to discuss is Richard Ferrer, editor of Jewish News. Richard, thanks for joining us. I wonder if we can start with those comments by the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations, holding up a placard which he claims is being shown to children in Palestinian schools, how to kill a Jew. It is something that Sky News has not been able to substantiate. But what is true is that there are elements of indoctrination within the Palestinian education. Is that your view?
Yeah, it's been going on for years and years, and congratulations to Sky for being at the forefront of showing people exactly what's happening in the Palestinian communities from top to bottom. Palestinian children are taught, if there are any Palestinian children watching this, obviously the best way to stab me is here, here and here. And sarcasm aside, I want to just emphasise quite how common place this sort of stuff is. The Palestinian Authority, which is the ruling party in the West Bank, calls on its own official media Jews apes and pigs. Town squares and streets are named after terrorists and suicide bombers. This sort of indoctrination is widespread and it's been going on for years.
At the same time, as I mentioned, Sky News has not been able to substantiate the accuracy, the validity of the Israeli ambassador's comments. But there's indoctrination on both sides of this. You go into Israeli schools, you think of the teacher in 2014 who was forced to a hearing because they dared to question the moral action, the morality of actions taken by the IDF in the occupied territories. You look at maps in Israeli schools, they commonly don't have the green line that divides Israel from the West Bank, Gaza and so on. I mean, there comes a point, doesn't there, where you have to rise above all of this and notice that there are legitimate concerns on both sides of this.
This blurring of the boundaries is indicative, and that's the problem. It's state sanctioned from top to bottom. School children...
Mahmoud Abbas has said that he wants to see peaceful protest. There's not a political leadership behind what some are now beginning to refer to as the early stages of a third intifada.
Mahmoud Abbas, who is seen as the mainstream area, he's not even Hamas, he's the mainstream person that the Israelis and the Americans are meant to deal with, calls in Arabic for more and more of these attacks and welcomes them when they come. Whenever there is a right wing, if you want to call it, a settler movement issue, problems in the West Bank, they are called out, they are isolated, they are dealt with, and the Israeli government comes down hard on them. They're an embarrassment to mainstream Israeli society, which longs for, hankers for peace.
We have, though, in recent weeks and months, seen a return to that policy of bulldozing on the part of the Israelis, which was largely abandoned in 2005. I mean, you know as well as I, the kind of feelings that engenders, even if the buildings that you are targeting are those possessed by those who have been most obstinate on the Palestinian side.
The lack of a peace process creates a vacuum, and that vacuum creates frustration and anger, and it creates violence. But it's no coincidence that it's young people, teenagers, 20-year-olds, that are currently going out in the streets with knives and stabbing people, stabbing kids coming out of sweet shops on their bikes. These are people that have been indoctrinated since they were young.
To be fair, the protests that I have seen have had a very wide age range in those that have occupied. You've had professionals, the lawyers' protest from the other day. You've seen senior citizens on the front line. It's not just the kind of the 16 to 21-year-old disaffected youth we're talking about here.
Generally speaking, we are seeing a bit of a sea change now. We are seeing people in their 20s who have no memory of the second intifada in the early 2000s, who have been told since they were 2-3 years old, they've been seeing these little cartoon characters that tell them Jews are monsters, Jews are evil, Jews steal their land, and they've grown up, and now they are instilled in this kind of hatred that makes them literally grasp a potato peeler or a meat cleaver and hack Jews in the streets to death.
Do you see any other end to this than more violence? I mean, what do each side have to do to step away from what is, at the moment, looking pretty bloody, with an expectation that it's going to get bloodier?
You know, last summer, during the Gaza war, that was pretty low, that was pretty scary stuff. But that was Hamas against the Israeli government. Now you're seeing a street-level issue, and I've been talking to people in Israel, and they work with Arabs in middle-class suburban areas of Jerusalem, and they have never seen this sort of intolerance and hatred in their eyes. It's imbued in this kind of middle-class area, as well as the young people and the disenfranchised and the people that have been stereotyped and brainwashed by the Palestinian media. It's also in the middle classes as well. I tell you, we have never had a darker period than we have currently.
I think on that, most people will agree with you. Richard, thanks very much.